Welcome back to Missing. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing great today, Tim. I hope everyone out there who's listening, I hope they're all doing just as well. Tim, I am still beside myself with the guest that we have on today and her harrowing past life and journey to freedom and what she's done with her life since she's gone through this extraordinary experience. There are very few conversations that we can speak to the person themselves who have done something like this, who have been through what she's been through, and my jaw was just on the floor. But Tim, I'm going to pick up my jaw, and I'm going to let you tell me how you're doing. How are you today?
I'm doing great after you tucked that jaw back in. Doing great over here, and very excited to introduce the conversation that we had with Miriam Lewin and Steve Fishman. Now, Steve Fishman has been on our airwaves a couple times in the past, most recently to speak about My Friend the Serial Killer, which is a new podcast that he produced. But this is another new podcast that he produced, and you can find it. It's on the podcast feed called The Burden. This show is called Avenger, and Miriam is the main focus of this podcast. Miriam Lewin is an Argentinian journalist who was disappeared by the communist Argentine government that ran the country from 1976 to 1983. And it's really a wild story. Miriam was in concentration camps as a 19-year-old political activist, and she survived it. Her husband did not, unfortunately. And that comes up in the podcast, The Avenger. Juan Estevez, her husband, did not survive. And part of this conversation that is so unspeakably evil, Lance, are these death flights that occurred that killed thousands of people who disagreed with the government at that time.
Yeah, we don't really use that term very often, how evil something is, but to concoct the plan that these officials concocted to eliminate, to first, like you said, she was disappeared, so that's what they call it. She was disappeared, so there's phase one of the plan. But when they proved to be not useful to this regime any longer, yeah, these death flights, and you heard it correctly, we're saying death flights took place, and hard to put a word on it. I mean, there's some topics that we discuss that we can call horrific and tragic and evil, but this is just on a scale that's kind of, like you said, kind of hard to comprehend. And she survived. I mean, she proved that she was a capable worker, and that's essentially what saved her. But like you said, tragically, her husband did not, and so many others.
Yeah, I believe it seems like they were trying to sort of use her background as a journalist to help their cause, and that was really the only reason she was able to survive. But these death flights, Lance, they drugged these people, brought them up into the air, and opened the back of the plane, and these people were pushed out while they were still alive. And as it's spoken in the interview, the ocean swallowed them up in most cases, and in a couple of notable cases, that did not happen, that we get to in this conversation as well. So, yeah, it is a wild story, and definitely highly recommend the podcast, The Avenger. So definitely check that out. It's on the podcast feed called The Burden.
And if you take anything from this, take the fact that Miriam is such an upbeat, positive person. From her tone, you'd never guess that she went through these horrors. I mean, before we started recording, we were chuckling about various things, the weather, and just a bunch of stuff. And then we had moments during the conversation that lighter moments, but it takes a lot of strength to pull yourself up out of that and make something more productive and still maintain your mission to make sure that justice is served.
Yeah, and she is one of Argentina's leading journalists today. So it's really quite a cool experience getting to interview her and discuss this story. And she was in Buenos Aires when we recorded this, so there was quite a delay in the recording, as you see on any news program, if someone's halfway around the world, there typically is a couple second delay at least. And so we were dealing with that a little bit here. So that's why there probably wasn't as much back and forth as a normal episode. But also, we just didn't want to interrupt her. She's a great storyteller, and she told the story.
Yeah, exactly. She had a certain way about telling the story, and the delays kind of helped because it forced me to not want to interject with just a question like in the middle of what she was talking about, because it would have come in like 5 seconds later. We would have had this whole like interruption of her storytelling, and it just would have derailed the entire conversation. So in a way, the delay was a blessing in disguise.
Okay, everyone, I hope you really enjoy this conversation with Miriam Lewin and Steve Fishman. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with them both. Make sure to follow us on social media at MissingCSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody.
And stay tuned for the end of the episode where Tim and I are going to give our final thoughts on this conversation. This is something that we've started to do and we're going to continue to do because we're learning new things just as you're learning new things. And, we just love to share that. So enjoy this conversation and stay tuned to the end.
Miriam Lewin and Steve Fishman, welcome to the podcast. How are you both doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Fine, yeah. I wasn't going to speak for both of us. Good.
Thanks.
Well, luckily you're both doing fine. Thank you again for joining us. Miriam, you're joining us from literally the other part of the world, a different country. It looks like it's a much warmer climate. Steve, if you're not watching this on the YouTube, Steve is wearing the coolest hat I've ever seen because it's a little chilly where he's at. But for those who don't know who each of you are, can we introduce ourselves to the audience? Can we start with Steve? Because Miriam, you're really the subject of focus here, and people probably know Steve. So, Steve, can you introduce yourself and then toss it over to Miriam?
Sure. So Steve Fishman, a longtime print journalist, a staff writer at New York Magazine, who was fortunate enough to jump to podcasts a few years back, and it's just been a great experience. We've been able to create a bunch of series, really true crime series, The Burden, then Empire on Blood, and now we have Avenger, which is not exactly true crime in the traditional sense, but is based on a almost staggering crime that occurred some 30 years ago. Miriam, maybe a little bit longer, but really a crime that Miriam will tell you about. And I'll just give you a little background. We were really excited to connect with Miriam, and it was funny because we started talking about the possibility of a different podcast. And then Miriam mentioned this particular story that she lived through. Now, Miriam has been a really kind of leading or the leading investigative journalist in Buenos Aires for a while. And this is a story that combines both her journalistic background and her personal story. And when we heard it, we just thought it's so moving and so important. We felt we had to do the podcast. One other thing I'll mention is that we did the interviews in Spanish and then translate them into English. And we were lucky enough to get Miriam's favorite childhood star, Alexis Bledel, to voice Miriam. And the interesting about Alexis is, she's an American, but her dad's Argentinian. So her first language was Spanish. So it actually really meshed with, in many ways, with Miriam's character.
I live in Argentina. I was born here. In the 70s, I was a political activist, and I was kidnapped during the dictatorship when I was 19. I was a teenager. I was a student. I was kept in two clandestine detention centers. The first one, a small detention center. This detention center was in downtown Buenos Aires, but nobody knew it existed. So they kidnapped and tortured people and kept them there. And then I was transferred to a second detention center, much bigger. And the method these men, Navy officers, had to eliminate the prisoners was throwing them into the ocean at night from a plane, right? We didn't know at that time for sure that was what was going on at the ESMA, School of Navy Mechanics. That was the name of the detention center. But then I survived. I lived in New York for 4 years. When I came back to Buenos Aires, when democracy came back to Argentina in 1983, I started working after a while as a journalist, and I became an investigative reporter. But then I didn't want to investigate topics related to the dictatorship because I felt that I could get very emotional. I wouldn't be able to keep a distance, right? And I thought this was wrong. But then I realized when I went to an ethics workshop in the U.S. in Florida, that this was a plus. Having experienced torture, having experienced being deprived of all rights in the 70s, made me more capable of interviewing people and investigating topics related to the dictatorship. And here is when comes the second part of the story. I don't know if Steve can go on.
I can go on a little, but I want to underscore a couple of things that Miriam said. First of all, she's 19. She's a political activist like a lot of people have been on a college campus. She's surrounded one day by soldiers from the recent military junta. And she's taken to a detention camp, which it always astounds me, is in the middle of the city. I just always imagined that because there was torture there, neighbors had to be able to hear what was going on. And it just stuns me as to what people will tell themselves and ordinary citizens will let pass as ordinary life. And I think sadly that's a question that a lot of us may face coming up.
Right. Like what you're saying is, sorry to interrupt, but it's such a good point. What you're saying is, at one point when they discovered that this was a thing, it probably seemed shocking, but gradually it just became the way of life. And that's really the dangerous tipping point, right? That's what you're saying, that at some point, the people that knew just kind of let it go because what are they going to do? We just have to accept this or else it's going to, take them in too.
Well, let me tell you, some neighbors agreed with that method, kidnapping people and making them disappear, right? But most of them were terrorized. I mean, they just well, this was a dictatorship, so you couldn't go to the police precinct to tell something weird, something irregular was going on next door, right? Imagine that this clandestine detention center was 2 blocks away from the federal police national headquarters. So they had to know. They couldn't ignore what was going on.
So the other thing that I want to add is Miriam talked about people being eliminated, which was a nice way to say executed. And that the way that happened is they were drugged, put on a cargo plane at altitude. The back door of the plane would open and people would be pushed out the back into the ocean. One of the points here is that they were still alive when they were pushed out the back. So the cause of death was impact. And I think 90% of the people in these camps were killed that way. These became known as the death flights. And sometimes you'll hear that word, and sometimes people will hear the word disappeared. People who just suddenly vanished from their lives. Their families couldn't contact them. Nobody knew where they were. They were presumed dead in many cases. Miriam she was tortured. She couldn't communicate with her family. She couldn't communicate with friends. And she was fortunate enough to not be one of those people who was put on a plane, but she was witness to all these people who had become friends being eliminated, which is a different kind of torture.
Well, what happened is that I survived, and you may ask yourself, why? How come? Well, because as in the Nazi camp, some of the prisoners were selected to work, right? To work for the military. This meant making translations, this meant taking photographs, cleaning, building, printing, whatever was needed at the concentration camp. And the special feature of this camp is that it was run by an admiral. He was commander-in-chief of the Navy, and he wanted to become president, right? And he knew that if he wanted to become president of Argentina after the dictatorship, he had to seduce voters of the Peronist Party, which is a huge party here, a huge movement here in Argentina. As we, the prisoners, were Peronists, he wanted to absorb our knowledge about Peronist policies. So that's why he kept us alive, and that's why some of us were released, because we were slaves working for this crazy admiral, right? So when I was released, I had to stay for a while in Argentina until they gave me my passport, and they let me go to New York, where I had some family. I stayed there for a while. When I came back, we had the trial of the military juntas, which is a very important time, 1985, for Argentine history. It didn't happen elsewhere in Latin America, right? And that made me feel that the military weren't going to come back to Argentina, right, to rule Argentina, as they had done in the past, because we got to punish them, to send them to jail. When I started working as a journalist in 1985, I didn't know I was going to investigate topics related to the repressors I had been a victim of. But then, in 2007, an Italian photographer came to Argentina. His name is Giancarlo Ceraudo, and he told me that he wanted to take some photos because they were going to run a story in an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica. Well, we met, he took some pictures, and then he asked me the question. Do you know with the flights aircrafts might be? And I was like, what? And who cares? What for? And he told me those airplanes could lead to the identification of the pilots. And the pilots were the murderers, right? To tell you the truth, that was the first time I got to think about the responsibility of the pilots. I had thought of the responsibility of the repressors I had met at the ESMA, but I had never thought that the pilots of those planes were responsible of the death of students, housewives, college teachers, bishops, nuns. It was terrible because the figure is only at the ESMA they killed 4,000 people, most probably with this method, with this procedure. They were sedated, right? They were stripped of the clothes. They used a truck to take them to unconscious to the airport, and then those planes carried those people in the middle of the night and threw them into the ocean. They wanted to disappear the bodies of the desaparecidos, to leave no trace whatsoever of them. Well, let me tell you that we started working with Giancarlo, and it wasn't difficult to locate the planes because those aircrafts had been bought by the Navy, and they had been used, some of them, by the military for the Malvinas Falkland Wars. So from 5 of those planes, 2 were lost in Malvinas, right, in the islands. The 3 others were one in Luxembourg, the other in the UK, and the third was in the US, in St. Petersburg, not far from Miami. And you know that the planes had been active because they were sturdy planes, highly appreciated by pilots, right? So these planes, active both in the 70s, in the early 70s, were still active in the year 2007, 2008. We tried to get in touch with the owners of the planes to see if they knew of their history, right? Of course, in the UK it was impossible because the planes that plane was serving the UK military. So imagine I was Argentinian. I mean, they wouldn't even answer the phone. Same thing happened in Luxembourg, and then we tried through a stringer, through a freelance journalist, because we didn't have the time, we didn't have the money nor the time to travel to Florida, and we sent a very smart Argentine journalist who was residing in Miami, but he was specialized in sports. His name is Bruno Bain. So Bruno went to interview the owner of the plane, and the owner of the plane didn't know the past, the dark past of that plane. The model was Short Skyvan. It's The plane is very weird because it's like square and small, and it looks like a bird. I don't know. It's I don't know, Steve. How could you describe the Skyvan? But it's an ugly plane, right? But when he was leaving, when Bruno was leaving, the owner of the plane says, "Wait, I have some flight logs here," and he had the flight logs for the whole life of that plane, including the 70s. So they had these logs with the date of the flight, the duration of the flight, the name of the pilots, and the origin of the departure point of the plane, right, and the destination, right. So Bruno sent us the copies of these flight logs, and we had to translate the logs because they were written in aviation language, and we didn't know what it meant. We could imagine, but even the names of the airports were like AZE or I don't know, IND, whatever. So we needed a pilot to translate that for us. But the thing is that the pilots we contacted at that time were terrorized. One of them didn't even come to the appointment, to the coffee shop where we were supposed to meet him. He just left the country, right? And the second one told us that some of the flights, the death flights, were done at night, generally on Wednesdays, right? And some of them were completely illogical from an aviation point of view. Like they left Buenos Aires, flew for like 4 hours, right? And came back to Buenos Aires. Like you can imagine, they flew into the ocean, threw the corpses to the water, and came back, right? When we told them, look, we want to go public with this, well, our intention was do a report on Telenoche Investiga. It's like Telenight Investigates, which was the program I was working for, right? But then he said, no way, they could kill me, right? Because most of the military pilots in 1978 started working for commercial airlines. In fact, 2 of the pilots of the death flights we investigated and identified were flying all the time Buenos Aires, Madrid, Buenos Aires, Miami, Buenos Aires, Rome for Aerolíneas Argentinas, Argentine Airlines. So most probably I flew with them without knowing. And also Giancarlo, who was coming to Buenos Aires from Rome all the time. Well, what happened is that we had to file those flight logs to a judge. I mean, we gave them to the judge who was investigating the what was called the mega ESMA cause, investigating the concentration camp I was kept at, and they added this death flights chapter.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Do you find it remarkable that they kept the flight logs for these death flights? Because they could have easily not kept those flight logs.
No, what surprised me is that I learned that every plane has to keep the flight history, right? Because it's not like a car. You sell a car, you buy a used car, and who cares if it's an old car that ran 100,000 kilometers or 50,000 or 15,000. For a plane, that is vital because it's dangerous if you don't know exactly the amount, the quantity of flights, right? The repairs, because it's a plane. I mean, it could kill you if you don't know the story, right? Because what surprised me the most is that no one in Argentina had thought of this. I mean, the human rights organizations, they never thought that if they looked for the planes, the guilt of the pilots could be proven by those flight logs, those technical logs, right? So when we gave the judge these logs, he analyzed the flights and he came to the conclusion that one of the flights was the one that was used to eliminate the founders of the organization Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, who were mothers that were looking for their children, for the missing children, right? Plus two French nuns, Alice Domont and Leonie Duquet, who helped them find their children, who supported them, and who were also kidnapped at the ESMA. And they were last seen at the ESMA December 14th, 1977. And guess what? December 14, 1977 was a Wednesday, right? And there was a flight that night. And what happened? Because you can imagine this is not precise. I mean, you can tell me, who cares? I mean, could be a coincidence. There was a storm that night, so and several days after that, so the bodies of the mothers and of the nuns were found at a beach 200 kilometers south of Buenos Aires. So the ocean spit them out. And there was a doctor, a police doctor, very honest and brave police doctor, whose name was God, in Spanish, Dios. His last name was God. I mean, this is amazing. But, I mean, it couldn't happen because usually the ocean swallows the bodies, right? But because of this storm, the water spit them out. And there was this doctor that wrote down in the autopsy that the fractures of the bones of those bodies were the proof that they had fallen for a very, very high height, right? Because they were not horizontal but vertical, and that's the proof of the crime. That's the proof that those bodies fell from the sky. And the police, the local police, buried those bodies at the cemetery, and they were identified in 2005. That means that was 2 years before I started looking for the dead flights, for the planes and the pilots. and the forensic anthropologists team identified those bodies in Buenos Aires. Then we had all those elements. It's like a puzzle, right? The nuns and the mothers were last seen at the clandestine detention center of the ESMA, December 14th. Then we had the storm. Then they found the bodies. They performed the autopsy, right? And then they buried the bodies. In 2005, they identified the bodies, the bodies as the bodies of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. Three of them, the rest are still missing, and the two nuns. And then Giancarlo and I identify the planes, and therefore we identify the pilots, and we came across this incredible way of proving that three pilots called Aru, D'Agostino, and De St. George were the murderers of the mothers and the nuns.
Wow. As the pilot, I guess, being the murderer, does the pilot doesn't push them out while also flying the plane? Are there other people there too? Or is it just we're saying the pilot is the most culpable because we have their name on the list?
Well, it's not only the list, but when you fly a plane, you cannot open the door whenever you want because it's dangerous, right? So the order had to be given by the pilot. And if you see the short Skyvan, the Skyvan aircraft, you see that it's very short. So the pilots could not ignore what was going on at their back, right? And when they authorized the rest of the crew, okay, let's open the door. It's safe now. They knew what was going to happen. They couldn't deny it.
To this point, I wanted to echo, if you read about the Nazis, you find out that the people who were part of the death machines, in some cases, they were just bureaucrats. They were just people who later said, of course, that they were following orders. They had small parts in this. And so, the amazing thing, one of the amazing, really stunning and horrible things is that there is this mechanism, this almost human machine put in place to create and carry out the death machine. So one doctor becomes the doctor who shoots people up as they go along, as they get on the plane. There's another group that takes their clothes off. Then on the cargo plane, it's a cargo plane. Are other people who push them out of the plane. And, communicating with the pilot, okay, we're at height. And then this door, this cargo door, which I imagine makes a noise opening to the sky. That was the thing about the sky vans. They had this big, huge door in the back so they could load cargo. And here, these people were using this cargo door to push people out of the plane one by one. I also just want to emphasize, listen, we call this Avenger. It's actually, if people want to look for it's listed as the Burden: Avenger. It's an amazing story, and there's a lot of it. And one of the things is that Miriam has told it very quickly and in some ways humbly, but there is a kind of amazing number of things that come together. The first one is this young Italian journalist who's a bit naive and a bit annoying, shows up at Miriam's door almost literally and says, after a while, we need to investigate the planes and the pilot. And they set off on this journey, which lasts, I think it lasts like 20 years, 15 years. So Miriam is somebody who's disappeared, captured off the street, right? She's thrown into a camp. She's tortured. She survives. And then she comes out and, over a period of time, becomes an investigative journalist who investigates the death flights. And she and John Carlo, this guy who's, I don't know, 10 or 15 younger, who's cute and impudent and annoying, they form this like dynamic duo, incredibly unlikely. He's Italian, she's Argentinian, and they together for a long period of time, years, are looking for these planes and these pilots. And then they get this break because they find the plane in Florida. The TV station she's working for will not cough up the money to send a journalist to Florida to check it out. So they connect with a guy who's a sports writer in Florida. And this sports writer goes, talks to the owner, who says, well, I have these flight logs. Then the flight logs are the key. They're the treasure. I don't even know if Miriam and Giancarlo knew they were looking for them at the time. But he has records going back 20, 30 years. And there are the names of the pilots. Finally, the names of the pilots. So I'll leave it there, but I think that Miriam, kind of in her telling, there's so much to tell, and she's so humble about it, that the kind of, I mean, I'll say it, the kind of persistence, heroic persistence over a long period of time, it's an incredible thing to hear about, to learn about. It's also an incredible story. I mean, as a narrative of two people, and really Miriam, it was Miriam's burden in a sense, fighting a system which did not want to yield up the names, which did not want to go after these, said it did not want to reopen, quote unquote, wound of the past. And so for 15 or 20 years, Miriam and this Italian journalist are fighting against the system until finally there is some measure of justice done. And I'll certainly let Miriam pick up there.
When all the documents were filed by the pilot, but one of the pilots that finally agreed to do so, and a Nobel Peace Prize, Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, they went to court and they informed the judge that these pilots were around and that they should be investigated. But the thing is that that file, right, that judge had a lot of other military being investigated in the same file. So all the lawyers of the repressors had access to that information. So Giancarlo and I thought, look, these guys are permanently flying out of the country. They are going to Spain, they are going to France, they are going to Rome, they are going to Florida. So if they learn that they are being investigated because of their participation in the death flight, they might choose to stay abroad and goodbye. I mean, who knows? So we started putting together a plan to get the pilots arrested in Europe, right? We talked to one of the nieces of the French nuns who lives in Rome. Her name is Geneviève Janingro, and she agreed to go to Paris, to fly from Rome to Paris and tell a French judge that the murderers of her aunt had been identified in Argentina, and that she knows that they are flying to Europe. So, being either Madrid, either Rome, either France, the French judge could order the arrest of the pilots, right? Well, finally, after like a year of anguish and tension and fear that our work could be spoiled because one of the pilots could choose to stay abroad, right? Being, I don't know, Rome, Italy, Spain, whatever. The Argentine judge, his name is Sergio Torres, ordered the arrest of the three pilots. One of them died in the first year, and two of them were got a life prison sentence in November 2017. We put together a plan because we were aware that the Argentine judge wasn't in a hurry to arrest the pilots to take them to trial, right? And we feared that they could find out that they were already being investigated and they could be arrested, so they could choose to stay abroad when they flew abroad, right? Because they were international flight pilots. But finally, around April 2011, they got arrested. One of them died while in prison, right? And the other two got a life sentence. That happened at the end of November 2017. So when Giancarlo now started investigating, it was around August, September 2007. It took like 10 years to take them to before court to get the final sentence. And then another thing happened. A couple of years ago, we started thinking that that plane, now in Arizona, it had been sold by the Florida company to another company, right? Whose owner was a big fan of the Skyvans. He owned 8 Skyvans, and one of them was our Skyvan, right? So we located that plane and we asked the government to bring it home. And now the plane can be seen at the memorial site of the ESMA in Buenos Aires. And that was extremely moving because the families of the people killed in that plane were at the airport when the plane came flying all the way from Arizona with around 10 stops because the autonomy of the plane is very short, right? But we were there waiting for the plane, and that's extremely moving, and it was meaningful for the daughters of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, for the niece and the families of the French nuns, and for the human rights movement in Argentina as well. And of course for Giancarlo and I.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And it's just sinking in how privileged Tim and I are to be a part of this conversation with yourself, who survived this and then embarked on this mission to bring those responsible to justice. And not only that, but make sure that there was something to commemorate those who were murdered, the genocide that was committed. I mean, this is an incredible conversation. You've been an incredible guest. I am like kind of beside myself. That's just a remarkable story. And yeah, you're like a remarkable survivor. Thank you for sharing it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope we can meet sometime. You're helping us a lot because you know that here in Argentina, the situation for the human rights movement is very, very, very difficult. So any help we can get from abroad is huge for us. Thanks a lot. Thanks to you guys.
Thank you so much, Miriam. We really appreciate your time here. Your story is incredible, and the podcast is amazing. We will certainly point all our listeners in that direction. And here we are back with final thoughts after the conversation with Miriam Lewin and Steve Fishman. Wow, what a great conversation. It's an incredible story. It's a story of survival, also like an incredible human darkness. I get you really can't avoid that part of the story, even though it's a bit triumphant in Miriam's case. It still leaves you with this feeling of, wow, I can't believe humanity is capable of doing that to itself.
Over and over again, right? This is a cautionary tale like none other. When we hear about concentration camps, we always think about the Nazis in Germany and the Holocaust. Most of us don't consider that many other nations and all across the world in different sections of time have gone through something similar. And this was in the 70s and 80s, and something that happened to, I'm sure, a society. I'm sure that community was not expecting it to happen, or the process was so quick that they didn't have time to react. And she had said during this conversation, this was happening right in the middle of town, right? Like,
yeah.
People knew. There's no way that they didn't know that this was happening. But when you are going up against a regime that's so strong and I don't know, resolute, that what are you going to do as an individual? It must have felt so helpless.
Yeah, I think self-preservation takes over, it seems. And Steve sort of filled in some of the questions that we had on, how does this happen? And specifically, I think I asked about the pilots being considered the murderers of these people because, well, they didn't push the people, right? Yes, they flew the plane, opened the back door, but they weren't the ones who drugged and pushed them. But as Steve described, much like the Nazis, it was sort of like, you have your job here, this doctor will drug you, this pilot flies the plane, and this person guides them onto the plane, and this other person pushes them. So essentially it's a ladder. It's a lot of people doing a little bit, and it makes up just this overall evil, these evil acts.
The one question that I don't think I asked, but I keep thinking about it every time, and then hearing this back again made me, I don't know, it just stood out in my head even more, is the fact that they drugged the people to abduct them, to get them on the plane, but by the time they pushed them out, they weren't so much drugged anymore.
Well, they were still alive.
They were alive. They were aware of what was happening. Like, there was no reason why they couldn't have further drugged them so they didn't even know they were being tossed out of the plane. They could have done something to make sure that their last moments of life weren't this, like, confusing, terrifying, impending death moment. Like, they could have put them in a state where they didn't even realize that this was happening, and that could have just been it. And that would have been the most disgustingly humane thing to do if you're charged with doing this, but they didn't. They didn't care if the drugs had worn off or not. They didn't care what the person was feeling when they were being rolled out of the cargo door.
Yeah, I think the drugs were to make it easier on the captors, right?
Yeah, to abduct them, right?
Yeah, to get them on the plane willingly, and to, that they're not freaking out and fighting them up in the air. They're just able to push them easier.
Exactly. So it wasn't even about, like, making them comfortable. It was about the efficiency of the kidnapping itself. It's absolutely bonkers to think that type of malice exists. But good for Steve Fishman for connecting this and producing the show, and his company Orbit, and everyone who's behind this show, Avenger.
Yeah, Some of the journalism in this story is really amazing. Actually, being able to track those specific planes that were involved back in the 70s and 80s, track them all across the world and to Florida, and then they get the logs. They get some of these plane logs and are able to decipher which ones were the death flights. And then they stuck it to some of the pilots. I mean, it's really an unbelievable story.
Yeah, it's a great, like, Justice is Coming story. Great title. I mean, such an apropos title. The flight logs were so amazing to me as well during this conversation. They were still following, because we asked about that. Like, why would they keep a log of this illegal activity? Why wouldn't they fake it? Or, you know, why would they even, like, create a paper trail that this happened? But the answer was that they didn't think that they were doing anything wrong. Essentially, this was part of the protocol. They needed to know what flights were up and what flights weren't up. Like, that was how business-like it was.
Yeah, and I think when someone else takes that plane over, they kind of need to know where it's been, how many flights it's had, so they know if there's some wear and tear on it or something like that. Miriam kind of said, it's an airplane, it can kill you. So you need to know, like, what mechanically could fail on this and how many miles it's traveled, much like a car. It's almost like a Carfax report. Yeah,
but I mean, still, like, they could have fudged the numbers so it didn't perfectly align with when these flights were taking off. I mean, it's just like that's so terrifying to me that it was just handled like a regular plane, just the way you would document the flights of a regular plane.
Yeah, it's pretty dark to
pretty
think
dark.
of. Yeah.
But hey, cautionary tale, we should all be aware that this continues to happen. This was only in the late 70s, early 80s. This isn't something that, was centuries ago. There are regimes out there that'll do that exact type of thing to their citizens.
Okay, so make sure to check out the podcast Avenger. It is on the Burden podcast feed. There are links in the show notes. Thanks a lot for listening here today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this conversation.